I have always loved horror, even when I was young. It stood out to me because it always made me feel something big. Sure, when you're a kid it's scary, but those emotions stick with you, and while horror can mean a lot of different things, sometimes the scariest stories aren't just the big-budget films or the iconic franchises. Sometimes it's the simpler things, the more mysterious kinds of horrors that leave the biggest impact. And that's where analog horror comes in. While this brand of horror is a relatively new part of the genre, often styled like a found footage series, though each series interprets this style very differently, and while they don't always have the same polish or production value that a mainstream horror does, but when done right, they are some of the creepiest and most fascinating horror media you can experience. But horror isn't my only passion. I also love Death Battle. If you are here, it is most likely you know what this channel is. It's the most well-known YouTube channel for putting two fictional characters and seeing them go head-to-head in a who-would-win fight to the death. And while Death Battle has dipped their toes into horror before, it is quite rare. Interestingly though, analog horror has been a surprisingly common fan request, with many different series being talked about when it comes to potential characters that could come onto Death Battle. And that's what I want to tackle here today. Can analog horror actually work in Death Battle? More specifically, which characters or series do work, and which ones don't? And what are some interesting matchups that might come out of these respective series? But since there is a lot of analog horrors out there, we are going to be making this a bit of a series. There is a lot to cover and a lot I want to go over that I think is worth talking about. So I believe the best way to do this is to go over analog horrors in their own respective videos. Make this kind of a series instead of just one big video. And we can talk about a lot of different analog horrors and give them the respected detail they deserve when considering them if they work in Death Battle as a whole. But since this is the start of the series, for part 1, I'm going to be talking about my favorite analog horror series of all time, and that being Vita Carnis. I've talked about the series a couple times on this channel before, but for those who don't know the series, I'll give you a rundown, and obviously there's going to be a little bit of a spoiler warning for anyone who hasn't seen the series yet and wants to see it. I'm not going to go over the whole entire series obviously, but just want to give a fair warning. But what the Vita Carnis series is about how one day mysteriously a bunch of random meat-based organisms started to appear on the Earth. There wasn't any explanation for them, at least at the time, but these creatures appeared in many different forms, from some being as simple as meat vines, known as the crawl. And at first they were beneficial, almost a miracle even. But the more that the crawl spread, the more things that got revealed, with things starting to grow from them. Starting with relatively innocent things like the trimmings being relatively simple creatures, but still kind of pest, but the creatures started getting more complex and dangerous as time went along, from giant meat snakes that would feed off of the dead, to man-eating creatures called mimics, who were humanity's ultimate predators, to even more when it comes to this bizarre world. But this series is way more complex than just random creatures appearing on Earth one day. This series goes from corruption of the mind to even cult worship. Basically, entire corrupt foundations, exploitation to try to gain control over humanity as a whole, under forces that even they don't completely understand. With this series going over how people deal with the Vita Carnis as a whole and the experiments that come from them, there is so much about this series that I love, and I honestly highly recommend this series for anyone who hasn't seen it yet. But anyways, let's talk about some of the things to help us understand how the series works in verses. One of these things is that the characters are calculable. While there isn't very direct showings or big event stuff that would really be that comparable in a versus analysis. Due to how relatively simple the series is and how low scale it is for the most part, it's actually not that hard to come up with some scaling for these creatures. Heck, I've actually done it before myself. So overall, it is definitely possible to use these characters in verses. And what helps them even more is that there is quite a lot of stuff to go over when it comes to this series, and more on the way since this series, at least at the time of this video, is still ongoing. But to get a good gauge of what we're looking at in full, and to see how these characters work in verses, we should take a look at the matchups they actually have to get a fair estimate on how the series stacks up in terms of actual versus potential as a whole. This will probably be the longest part of the video since we have 9 matchups to actually cover here, and I want to go relatively in depth on at least most of them. But I should say this before we get into the matchups. Obviously, every matchup I talk about here is going to be very much my opinion. If you disagree, that is perfectly fine, because in the end, we all have our opinions. But I want to give my take on these matchups. And obviously, I probably missed some matchups that people like from the series. So, if there was any that weren't on this list that you liked personally, comment them down below. But anyways, let's begin with the matchups I've actually talked about on the channel before. The first matchup, and probably what is considered one of the most popular for the series, is the Mimic versus Alternate from Mandela Catalog. This matchup is extremely well known within the analog horror community, and for pretty good reason. These two creatures are surprisingly similar. Both are creatures that seemingly come from the higher force that we don't fully understand, that being Gabriel and the Singularities. Both of them even have multiple different variants of their respective kind, with both of them also being known as some of the biggest threats to humanity, with them being their primary and mostly only targets. But both are known for their intellect and how they attempt to disguise as others. And there's even cases where they torment their victims as a whole, with certain individuals of the species, instead of directly taking out their human targets immediately when they easily could have, they both draw out the process, keeping them stuck in a room to die slowly, taunting them the whole way through. It's pretty obvious these two creatures have a lot of similarities, but they're not entirely similar to each other either, with them having completely different mindsets. Mimics just hunt for food, and seemingly just do what they need for survival, while alternates just hunt humans because they are attempting to replace them. It does kind of change depending on which alternate variant it is, but it is pretty much never for consumption purposes, and I find the dynamic pretty interesting here, with the Mimic not necessarily being an evil creature, just one that hunts human for food like any animal. Sure, sometimes they like to play with their food, but that's not too dissimilar from other creatures, in the real world at least. But the alternates are a straight up, basically pure evil force, with their main goal just being to torment humans before their death. And the debate is actually somewhat interesting. Both of them are pretty low scaling characters, and while the alternate is a little harder to find stuff for, it's not completely impossible, and when looking at the two side by side at least, since regardless of their lower or higher ends for these creatures, they actually stack up pretty similarly depending on the variants. Unless you include Gabriel, which obviously you wouldn't put in a fight like this. And while obviously the banter potential is kind of lacking, since neither of these characters are really known for their banter other than maybe the alternate, but they only really do that around humans. But I could see them taunting each other in some way, which definitely would be interesting. This is obviously a very different type of idea for a battle, especially in animation potential, with them both stalking around each other trying to get a human victim, and having slightly different but similar ways of doing it. But anyways, for what alternate you would use for this, it's pretty obvious most people when considering this matchup think of rather doppelgangers or false impersonators, and I think false impersonators are the more popular of the two. But this actually is the one that would make it the closest and have the most direct connections with the Mimic, at least as far as I'm aware. Again, while this battle doesn't necessarily have any banter potential if this was an animation, we have seen Death Battle do matchups like Hulk vs. Godzilla, and while there wasn't much banter between those two characters respectively, it still worked as a whole. And while obviously it's a little weird to compare this matchup to something like Hulk vs. Godzilla, it's still a point to get across that banter doesn't necessarily mean it can't work as a death battle. And while they don't exactly have much of a big power set, I still think the fight could be definitely more interesting than other things that they've done, and it really goes into that horror aspect, psychologically and physically. And personally, I think it actually might be my favorite for the Mimic overall if it ever were to get in a versus matchup. And the other matchup I've talked about on my channel before is the Mimic versus SCP-939 from the SCP Foundation. This actually used to be my preferred matchup for the Mimic, at least until I realized just how much more the alternates have in common with it, but honestly, this one still is not bad. The main connections are pretty clear. Both are meat-like creatures that hunt humans and mimic voices to lure in their prey, or at least disorient them. It's a simple, solid parallel, and I'd say it's easily one of the most talked about matchups for the Mimic, maybe even more popular than the alternate in some circles, because I've seen more fan-made trailers for this matchup than any other Vita Carnis matchup. Popularity aside, while to me it is definitely a relatively interesting idea, although to me it just kind of feels like the Mimic versus alternate, but feels like it has a little less working in its favor, at least in my opinion. Let me explain first. First of all is just the idea of the Mimic attacking 939 and not just trying to escape from it immediately, because I would get the Mimic fighting an alternate because it would confuse it for a person at first, but then after attacking it, then they would get in a duel, or they're both trying to hunt a person at the same time. That setup is a lot easier to believe. Here, on the other hand, the only setup that works is 939 attacking the Mimic, because a Mimic would not go out of its way to attack 939. My point here is, I just don't think the dynamic is as interesting, and doesn't make nearly as much sense in comparison. I'm not saying a matchup always needs to have a dynamic that always leads into a fight to the death, because obviously Death Battle has done matchups like that, but when one just makes more sense to happen like that, and also arguably has the better connections, I tend to lean towards that one a little more. But that's just me. But also, this fight basically rules out the Elder Mimic entirely, because I almost never see people talk about the Elder Mimic when this matchup is brought up, and I feel like that's a huge part of the character missing. Unlike with the alternates, with their variants, you can actually argue the Elder Mimic being involved makes sense. Or at least a little less iffy than this matchup does. And as a whole, I think that's what I just don't like about this matchup as much. I don't think the dynamic is as interesting. In comparison, the Mimic versus Alternate works because there's genuine psychological tension, both are intelligent, both use manipulation in some way, and both of their goals intersecting in some way of who can get their prey first is kind of an interesting idea to me. There's so many ways you can make the Mimic versus an Alternate work. And unfortunately, 939 just doesn't have that complexity that I think is nearly as interesting. Obviously, this is just my opinion, but I just think overall, this matchup doesn't work nearly as well, because of its lesser connections and also just less interesting dynamic. And in terms of debatability, it kind of depends. It can be close if somehow you're using the Elder Mimic, and if you're not, well, 939 wins this one pretty much hands down every single time. If you want to know why, just watch my video I made on it a while back. Even if that video isn't perfect, I think my opinion still stands on who would win that matchup. But that's not the point I'm getting across. I still like this matchup, but I just don't think it's the most interesting thing anymore for the Mimic when taking a little closer look at some of its other matchups. It just doesn't hit the same high points that the Mimic versus Alternate does, but it's still relatively up there when it comes to matchups for Vita Carnis. But anyways, yeah, let's go into the matchups that I haven't talked about on the channel before. And the first one I've seen thrown around is The Thing from John Carpenter's The Thing. And obviously these two's connections are pretty obvious. Both are highly intelligent mimics that hunt human targets and can not just imitate voices but also appearances. On paper, it sounds like a perfectly thematic fight. The problem is, it's not really a fight. There is no scenario where a mimic could realistically do any proper damage to the thing other than hurting it slightly. The thing's biology and adaptability and sheer level of infection, it pretty much has every advantage other than maybe speed, and even that's a stretch. Sure, Death Battle has made pretty entertaining stomps in the past, but unlike those episodes, this matchup just doesn't really have much else going for it to make it work here. There's not really any dynamic that could work, or any psychological things that could make it work. The mimic would probably mistake the thing for a person, attack it, and instantly get infected. That's about it. Unless I'm missing something, which you can put down in the comments below if I'm forgetting anything, there's not really much depth here other than their connections. But now, for the final matchup I want to talk about for the Mimic, I want to talk about one that came from my community page. Credits to Mr. Capitalism for the idea. This matchup is the Mimic versus the Volatile from Dying Light. I think that's how you say it. But anyways, both are intelligent humanoid predators who hunt people and act as the face of their respective series. I'm not as familiar with Dying Light as I am as the other series, but I still know a decent amount of stuff, and I do think this matchup has some interesting parallels. And actually might be one of the few matchups for the Mimic that actually warrant some type of army battle, since you can compare the different variants, like this basic Volatile versus a standard Mimic, and a Tyrant versus an Elder Mimic, with them pairing off relatively good. I think this is definitely an interesting idea, even if it doesn't have the deepest connections or the strongest narrative for these two, but I still think it's an interesting matchup and kind of fun to think about, and I might talk about it in the future actually. But ultimately, I feel like it's a slightly less refined version of the Mimic versus Alternate, but still not bad overall. Now we can finally move on from the Mimic, but as you probably can tell, there are very few creatures from Vita Carnis that work at all when it comes to verses, since a lot of the creatures there don't have any characteristics that would work at all in verses or have very little to go off of. They are pretty much impossible to talk about them, at least individually, but let's talk about a few more individual matchups in mind before we actually get into the bigger idea. With the first individual matchup we have is the Monolith versus the Tripod from War of the Worlds 1913. Both of these are two kaiju-sized monsters that seemingly appeared in our world out of nowhere, with our military being able to do very little in full against them. But they also respond to forces that are beyond them, that being the Singularities and the aliens in particular, with these beings being very destructive when they're actually in action. And while this matchup isn't talked about that much at all, I thought it was kind of an interesting idea, since it would be a kind of cool dynamic to see how these two would clash, based on how the tripods could get past the monolith's healing factor, or if the monoliths could actually affect the tripods with their EMP. While this is mostly a filler matchup, I still thought it was kind of an interesting idea, but now that we are on to the bigger matchups, let's get into the more interesting and in-depth matchups next. Now let's take a look at the main focus of Vita Carnis, that being the Singularity, which is kind of the center point of the whole series. And while there is little known about them, but there are two matchups that I decently like when it comes to verses, with the first one being the Singularity versus the Iris from Gemini Home Entertainment. This matchup actually does make quite a bit of sense. Both are seemingly cosmic individuals who see themselves as superior beings and interact with tech to usually communicate with others. and are basically the catalyst of the events of their respective series, being the reason why pretty much everything happens throughout it. And they want to gain control over the Earth. Personally, I think it has a lot of good connections, even if it's not respectively completely unique to this matchup in particular. There are other ones that fit this tone as well, but personally, since Vita Carnis and Gemini Home Entertainment are very similar to each other if you actually pay attention to the series, I like this parallel more than the other ones you could do for the Singularity. Except for one, but we are going to get to that. Although this matchup does have issues, but it's not singularly specific to this matchup. We'll get more into that in a bit, but while it definitely makes sense, I honestly kind of hard it to see how that lower scale Singularity compared to the Iris would even function, but honestly, I think it still works. And the other matchup that I like for the Singularity, and maybe slightly more, is AZ001 from Midwest Angelica. These two entities are almost impossible for us to fully understand, but once they showed up and were comprehended by humans, they began expanding their influence and began to transform the Earth entirely, and both are being connected to some type of religious view, with the Singularities praised by the cults and AZ001 being linked to the fallen angel Azazel by a group of cultists, with both of them trying to expand their corruption throughout the planet, seemingly. And I think both this and the Iris are interesting ideas in concept, but there is one major issue. It's hard to say how the Singularity would function individually as a whole, because the Singularity isn't an independent entity. There are 7 of them, and while they can seemingly be connected in some way, each Singularity has their own respective personalities, and it's really hard to gauge how powerful each of them are individually. Now, admittedly, because of the latest episode of Vita Carnis, we can actually get a proper gauge, but it feels more like this is Vita Carnis as a whole and less of the Singularity's direct power, since they get their full power from fusing with the Vita Carnis, making it a little difficult to decide how this even works. And also, it's hard to say how the Singularity's powers right now really do much, since the process of making Vita Carnis aren't even instant, so it's hard to say you can use them in an army battle sense, because this is a long drawn out process that takes time with dead creatures. They may be kind of godlike in a sense, but personally I just don't really know how it would fully function. But maybe we're looking at this the wrong way. Instead of comparing the Vita Carnis on an individual basis, let's look at them as a whole species. This, in my opinion, is the most interesting way to look at Vita Carnis in Versus. It allows us to see every aspect of the Vita Carnis race and allow every single being to be at their greatest. And I think it would be more fitting as a whole, since everything in the series is supposed to connect to one another. So let's take a look at 2 more matchups to see how this concept may work. And starting with the most popular one when it comes to this idea is Vita Carnis versus SCP-610, the Flesh That Hates from the SCP Foundation. This one I've seen around quite a bit for the series, and it definitely makes sense on the surface. 2 groups of beings that are defined by their flesh characteristics that come in many different varieties, and are relatively pretty intelligent for a race of creatures. I think this is a cool idea, don't get me wrong, but I do have my issues with it, and most of it comes down to my main question: how would this even work? Because despite these similarities between these 2 groups, the main issue is that it just doesn't really make sense. How can these groups fight each other and there be a winner? Because 610 isn't like a physical entity or something controlling it in the traditional sense, but 610 is a virus, and at least as far as I'm aware, the source of which is relatively unknown. And it's not like this is like some type of virus versus a virus and which virus would overwhelm each other. This is a physical race versus a virus that infects all living things. because every Vita Carnis would be infected, and while you could argue the Singularities wouldn't, there's not really any way that the Singularities can just stop 610, at least as far as we are aware. And while I do think the concept of the Singularities fuse the Vita Carnis and 610 together, which is definitely cool, but I really don't think this fight works in versus. It's a cool crossover idea, sure, but just not in the versus sense, because I just cannot understand how this fight would actually work. That's at least my opinion. You can comment down below if I'm missing anything, but I just cannot get into this matchup like everyone else does. But the matchup that I definitely can get into, and this one I actually want to talk about on my channel at some point, is Vita Carnis versus the Typhon from Prey. Both vast races of creatures that differ a lot in shape. Both stories take place much earlier than the modern day and lead up to it over time, and humanity becoming very interested in these creatures and experimenting on them, and both starting as manageable threats to potentially world-ending races. I think this is an awesome idea. I like the idea of all the different varieties of creatures going up against each other, and the idea that the Typhon, an alien race that wants to take over the Earth, finds their match in a race of creatures that seemingly were naturally born from the Earth, have already taken it over, and then from there the creatures would be immediately at odds with each other. I'm not going to go too much in detail yet. I do plan for this to be an actual video I talk about one day, but I do really like the idea of these different creatures going against each other, and also I think the Nightmare versus the Singularities would just be an awesome idea. But personally, this easily, I think, is the best for both, and I think this is personally my favorite for Vita Carnis as versus as a whole, since it goes over every aspect of the race and the series that individually the other matchups lack. And so yeah, it is pretty clear that Vita Carnis can work in versus, even if it's a little difficult, and you might have to be a little bit creative with how you use it depending on how high in scope you want to get, but it definitely can work. But that's only half the question, because we are not looking at specifically does Vita Carnis work in versus, we are looking for if it works in death battle, and there is a difference. Now, here are the things that really matter when it comes to what works for a death battle, at least to me. First, is there any measurable things or even any theories that we can gauge on how strong a series is? Or at least, at minimum, something we can theorize to a reasonable degree when it comes to power. And when it comes to Vita Carnis, I think it kind of does, although it is kind of on the border of working and not working. But I would say slightly more in favor of working. This series is a lot more grounded than most others, and it is a series we can get some pretty reasonable estimates from. And while definitely characters like the Singularities, which are probably the most important things to talk about when it comes to this show, is actually kind of hard to gauge in power, since, well, the only showcase of it was in the most recent episode, Necronic Wound. But this episode, believe it or not, made it from not being able to work to making it definitely possible to gauge how it could work. So I think overall, it does work in the end. But that's not the only thing that makes a death battle work, in my opinion. The other thing is, doesn't have a coherent enough story to make us understand the whole idea, and if that story can even function as a proper death battle analysis. And this is where Vita Carnis kind of struggles, because it's really hard to gauge the story of the series. Part of it is relatively simple, but its beginning we have no idea about, at least not at the current moment, and we just have a slight background of the Vita Carnis, but all that we have currently is that they simply showed up one day and the Singularities were a part of it. But most of its idea, we can only really start out with theories of it, and while Death Battle has gone with theories before with an analysis like SpongeBob's and SpongeBob vs. Super Friends Aquaman, but the problem is there isn't really a proper coherent theory that can actually work as a whole. to set up the whole series in any style that works in verses. And the biggest issue is that the series is still ongoing and we have no idea where it's going to have an ending point. We don't know how high in scale these characters can get, and we don't have a big enough story to make a full analysis so far to make it work, at least to me personally. And while this isn't always a problem, like take Michael Myers' analysis in Jason vs. Michael when it came out before Halloween Ends, but the difference is that we understood Michael more as a character and we kind of had a pretty good gauge of where he was gonna go. Vita Carnis, we don't really have that idea. We don't know the higher ends of the series, we don't know where it's gonna go. There is no endpoint at the moment, or enough of one to make a formation of how things might go, or to make an even complete analysis off of these creatures in any death battle format. In other words, Vita Carnis is too incomplete, and it really has to work on the whole species and not just on an individual basis, because by themselves we don't know enough about their story in order to make this fully work for a death battle. So you would have to include the entire race, but even then they still have little to go off of and no proper point that they can actually be analyzed in as a whole, because there's just not enough information to go off of. And personally for me, that's my main issue. And so my final verdict when I think it comes to Vita Carnis, I think it is very close to working. It has almost everything it needs, but it struggles with how it can fully work in an analysis, and it is really hard to gauge down the series because of it being incomplete. I don't think it has enough explained about it to make it fully work. This series is still ongoing, and there's still a lot of potential for more to go over, and I do genuinely think it can work eventually, and once the story is finished, I think we can definitely revisit this. So, in conclusion, it's not that this series doesn't work in Death Battle, it's the fact it doesn't work yet. But regardless if this series works in verses or not, it's still my favorite analog horror. It doesn't need to be anything that gets drafted to verses in order to make it my favorite. And even if the series, in my opinion, doesn't become Death Battle worthy one day, I would still love it the same. A series doesn't always have to work in a death battle to make it interesting. Heck, it doesn't even need to work in verses to make it interesting. Because that's not the point of analog horror. It's meant to be scary, it's meant to make you think, not necessarily just be put up against other fictional characters in a fight to the death. But it does make me interested to see which ones do work in full like that. Because versus actually isn't that simple as just watching two characters fight to the death. It's getting to know the characters more, and I think that's the biggest attribute I want to figure out. Can we analyze these characters in any other way other than the norm? Is there another way we can introduce these franchises to other people? And does analog horror as a whole, can it function as a death battle? And that's what this series is about, and I hope to figure out that in the future. But with that now out of the way, that reaches the end of part 1. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and the series as a whole. I get this is a new type of concept and I'm probably not exactly perfect at it, but I really wanted to try this idea out. And if you guys have any disagreements, or if you want to suggest any type of analog horrors I talk about in the future, feel free to leave them in the comments below. But for now, that's all from me. I will see you guys next time. Peace.